I'm looking at ways that some theories of couple satisfaction and marital stability can be tested with some neural correlates. So let me share my screen briefly, and then we'll get into it. Here is what I'm looking at. And one of the influences on my own therapy technique was Salvador Minuchin and Charles Fishman, who developed something called intensive structural therapy in the 1970s, 1980s. And what this involves is an idea that couples have problems in their relationship, and the problems are really due to structures that keep repeating themselves, ways of seeing each other, ways of seeing themselves that can't really change over time, or that don't change over time. And it came out of work from the Austrian biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and he hypothesized that people in relationships go into states of movement, but they move around certain steady states that seem to repeat again and again in their sentiments, in their emotions, in their thinking, and in their conversations. And this idea underlies the therapeutic technique that Fishman and Minuchin developed, which is to draw a couple out of these structures and to make them aware of the unconscious attractors or basins of attraction, thinking in dynamical systems terms of why they keep doing the things that they do. But as they go through that process in therapy, there's a time of chaos that happens where the system is no longer in steady state. Things are going all over the place. There's, in fact, an anxiety that the couples experience, which is the anxiety that they've sought unconsciously to avoid for so many years, as those unmet needs constantly come up in a way that is temporarily satisfying or temporarily stable in some way, but it is not fruitful, not productive, and doesn't lead to a fulfilling relationship. So, how do you test something that's unconscious? You could do something like an IAT, where you test people's reactions. But I thought it'd be interesting to test for anxiety by using some neural correlates of anxiety, which happen to be very highly developed at this point after about 2 or 3 decades of neuroimaging studies on fear and anxiety, probably the most robustly studied emotion. So what I want to do is to validate some of this theory, some of Minuchin and Fishman's theory, by finding evidence that anxiety and anxiety avoidance is really at the root of many marital problems. Happily, I've also been studying the work of John Gottman, who actually tracked people's behaviors in marriage, classified the couples according to if they were happy or not, and if their marriages lasted or not, and found these same patterns of dynamical attraction, where couples that were satisfied in their relationships, that were happily married, would be in the positive domain, where their sentiments would wind up in positive steady states after a conversation. Couples that were dissatisfied tended to end up in negative steady states. And in fact, just using the data from how people talk to each other, Gottman claimed he could predict whether or not a marriage would last with 95% accuracy, which is kind of amazing. And if the neural correlates of anxiety can be proven, it has the potential to link Gottman's work on the mathematics of marriage with Fishman and Mnuchin's work on the explanation for the dynamics of marriage, which would be a great thing and could potentially lead to some ways of predicting marriage longevity and marriage problems before people even got married. So how could you do this? How could you measure people's anxiety during therapy? Well, it has been done. And one of the first ways of doing it was by galvanic skin response, which is kind of broad because that also correlates to stress levels, anger, if you're perspiring or not, because it's hot in the room, and some other things. So it's not as accurate as you'd want it to be. But fortunately for us, there are some strong neural correlates of anxiety that have been tracked, as I said, over the last 2 decades. I want to go over those briefly. I'm going to propose a method that can be used in this proposed research grant. So they took some subjects that were healthy individuals that did not suffer from diagnosed anxiety disorders, and they conditioned them with neutral pictures, but then you had like a loud noise or a shock or something to scare you. Over time, they began to associate some neutral picture with the fear stimulus. And they noticed that the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, as well as the amygdala, which is over here, kept firing or becoming more active in fMRI studies when the fear-provoking stimulus was presented. This happens to be the same pattern that occurs in people that suffer from phobia when they're exposed to the thing that they are phobic of. Like somebody who has a spider phobia, exposed to images of spiders, activates or hyperactivates in these same areas. And they did similar work with people with PTSD. And this, I don't think I want to get into all of the details here, but it's quite interesting to me what actually happened in these studies and the neuroanatomy of fear that they discovered here. But I'll leave that for another day. So what I want to get into, they did it with OCD as well. Neural correlates of anxiety are some of the most robust out there. Now, are they robust enough to stick someone's head in an MRI and say you're suffering from anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, or you have a phobia of spiders? If I show you a picture of a spider, no. One subject, no. But it is robust enough to make binary classifications. In other words, you get 20 people and you test 20 of them for these neural correlates of anxiety in a certain condition, and another 20 in a different condition. You will be able to see a difference and say, yes, there is anxiety happening in this certain group, which is what I want to do. So what is my proposal? I want to take 2 metrics. Why? Because it's more reinforcing of one another if the 2 metrics agree with one another. So I want to take galvanic skin response as a biomarker for anxiety, as well as activation of the fear network. I want to take 20 to 50 couples in 2 conditions. 1, satisfied marriages. 2, unsatisfied marriages. I want to give them 6 sessions each from a trained intensive structural therapist for problems in their marriage. Now, the happily married couples probably not going to have as much motivation to go in there, but even happily married couples have problems they can work out in the therapy. And I want to track brain activation patterns in the fear network specifically and galvanic skin response during the therapy session. Now, possible confound. You say, well, aren't unhappily married couples more stressed out in general, and don't they experience more anxiety in general? Yes, they do. So possible confound there. What we're going to do is add 10 minutes prior to each therapy session where the couple just by themselves discusses a current problem in their relationship. So is it conflict that's causing the activation of the fear network in the brain, or is it the chaos that ensues when the unconscious motivations and drives are being uncovered in the therapy session? I think it's going to be greater in the therapy session. I think the anxiety and the chaos of the therapy is worse than just having a conflict. That's from my own experience. But let's see what happens. Get the grant money, go to work. Now, so you want to also just keep the therapist blind to any anxiety proxies that are being measured, and you want to have the therapist note in the timeline at what point he or she is initiating any interventions that are expected to bring out anxiety. The therapist should be aware of when those points are. That's when you want to test for significant activation over baseline. That is my idea. If it works, you're going to have support for Minuchin and Fishman's theory that anxiety avoidance is at the root of a lot of family dysfunction. Anxiety avoidance is at the root of a lot of repeated patterns of dysfunctional communication in marriage. That would be very helpful to the field in itself. But you also have the additional utility of this research of explaining the pattern that Gottman observed in those dynamical equations, in those dynamical processes and patterns that he observed in his work with couples when they were in conversation in their lab. So you have two major models of marital satisfaction reinforcing one another by finding a common cause, namely the anxiety, which you can do, since it's an unconscious factor we're looking for, you can do that with these neural correlates. Let me see if I covered everything here. And oh yes, finally, if this works, you reinforce the utility of Gottman's models, and you say this really have relevance. They can be used to predict, couple outcomes years in advance, just by something that doesn't involve self-report, that's just recording of people's conversations, which is actually the subject of the research of my master's thesis, trying to get the computer to identify these same patterns in order to classify couples and how much they have to be prepared for potential problems in a relationship. So it was good to talk to you. It was good to share with you. And sorry I'm not there to see your own presentations as well. Thank you for your time.